Yeah, so this one is interesting because, and again, it might end up being like the recurring theme of this particular video, today's episode, is the asymmetry of expectations, because this is something that I hit on in my videos. I know you hit on in your videos, and certainly we talk about it at great length when we collaborate. But there is this expectation that the left broadly and the Democratic Party in general, or specifically as the political proxies of the left, that we have to take great steps. We're obligated to reach across the aisle, not just to Republican politicians, but also to conservative voters. We need to understand them. You will see an op-ed in the New York Times, CNN, all the places, Washington Post, about how the left needs to do a better job of trying to understand the right. And I don't disagree with that, right? I do think that that sort of empathy and that sort of understanding, as much as you're capable of it, as much as we can, we need to pursue it. But this article points out from the Bulwark that it's one-sided, and that there is you won't find an op-ed on Fox News and OAN and Newsmax and all the things where people are encouraging the Republican Party and conservatives to try to understand Biden voters and Democrats. And that's the title of the article, what the media doesn't understand about Biden voters. So, Luke, what do you think about this? Like, because I know we talked about this, but the way that it's put into words, the way that it's encapsulated, where this guy has reached out to try to find examples, and he's coming up short, just a handful of examples over the past 6, 7, or 8 years. What do you make of that?
It's fascinating. For the sake of interest, we won't dive into specific excerpts, but I think Jessiah's summary is super interesting there. And it, as you said, would be absurd, or it wouldn't be absurd, be reasonable, but you would be stunned to see in Fox News coverage of different events, or OAN or Newsmax, or op-eds on their websites. You would not see. It would be shocking to see trying to understand Biden voters. But you see that
not
constantly,
in a condescending way.
Not
even
a condescending way, not at all. But you see that constantly in mainstream, kind of what is called liberal media. But also, to further that point, you see in right-wing media the constant talking point of, gosh, the left is not wanting to hear the concerns of right-wingers and of Trump voters, and you need to understand more where Trump voters are coming from. And you will never see in liberal media the same said about their side's voters, if you want to word it that way, in a two-sided framework. And it's that asymmetry of expectations that you've accurately coined that term, at least from my awareness.
We should trademark that. We should trademark that and make like merchandise and stuff like that.
Once you are observing American politics through that lens, it's obviously interesting, but pretty upsetting.
It is, and you start to clock it like on the regular. And so I was overjoyed when, in a weird way, I mean, it was very sobering, but I was like, finally, like a professional journalist put into words, what things that we talk about all the time. I think it's also interesting that you point out how, again, you very common, you hear the sentiment that, Democrats they've just abandoned the right. They've abandoned the working class. And there is some truth to that. But like the Republican Party hasn't, like right-wing populism hasn't to an even greater extent. And then the question goes to always Republican and Democratic politicians. Now, again, you and I do this every day. I'm curious because I can't think of one example where a Republican politician, where Donald Trump, where Ron DeSantis, or whoever, people running for president have been asked, what do you try to understand? What do you empathize with about the Democratic voter, the liberal voter, the progressive? How are you going to reach across the aisle, Mr. DeSantis, Mr. Trump, Mr. Christie, all the people? How are you going to reach across and try to represent them? It's that assumption is just never made. It's just okay for them to appeal to their base, Luke, and somehow just bank on the Electoral College, netting them a win. There's never that expectation. Biden gets that question all the time.
And I will say, just so y'all know, it's not just us sitting here, those snowflake libs want to have their feelings thought about more. No, I'm perfectly great with the way that mainstream media asks Biden and interviewers ask Biden, if you win, in 2020, how will you represent the more conservative part of the country that's going to vote against you? And that being something Democrats are asked a lot. And the issue is that doesn't also show up with Republican politicians. They never explain how they're going to lead the liberal part of the country that they're constantly fear-mongering about. And we've seen, for example, Ron DeSantis, Jessiah, as we talked about, is promoting the idea that not only will he win against the liberal candidate, but he will destroy leftism, I think was the exact quote,
destroy the left. Yes.
in
Yes.
America. And that would be his goal, would be to destroy an ideological movement, I guess, within the country. And never is the question, well, how are you going to unite the country, including those individuals? And Biden's constantly speaking to that. And anytime he does criticize Republicans, for example, MAGA Republicans, he has to say, not all, not all, not all, not all. And still they'll go, he said all
so
Republicans
all.
are. Exactly. And then last thing I'll say before letting you jump back in, Josiah, is if one side was going to be asked that and the other not, it makes sense actually for it to be flipped. I think both sides should be asked, but it would make more sense for it to be flipped because statistically, liberal positions are more supported in this country. So more of the country, and in the last, 8 presidential elections, only one Republican won the popular vote. So clearly, actually, when you take the numbers in this country, we're more liberal than we are conservative. But the questions that would lend themselves to that reality are completely flipped.
You know, it's funny when we talk about these things, and especially you, like, and maybe you feel the same way, but sometimes I feel like you need a pulpit because, like, that was a religious experience because there's so many, like, layers to this, like, this particular asymmetry of expectation because I'd actually forgotten. I've almost been gaslit at times to forget that the Democratic agenda, while not perfect, and nobody's saying that it's perfect, is point by point, issue by issue, more popular.
Wildly
so. This particular point, it bakes in a presumption of minoritarian rule. It does. Like, what is the majority going to do to cater to the whims of the minority? Well, what about the minority reaching across the majority? Now no, forget about that. That's ridiculous. It's so absurd. And I do want to say, just to co-sign, do I think that it's a fair question to ask? Yes. I think it's a fair question to ask any candidate running for office, not just the president, by the way, but also Congress people and governors and so on and so forth. What are you going to do to reach across the aisle? Because believe it or not, you have an obligation to serve your constituents, all of them, to the best of your ability. Now, you may think that the best way to do that is to adhere to a partisan agenda. Fair enough. But don't make it sound like, hey, not only am I going to follow the Republican Party textbook, I only care about pleasing Republicans. Like, at least come out and say, listen, like if somebody asked Governor DeSantis, I said, Governor, how are you going to appeal? How are you going to reach across the aisle? Even if he said something like to the effect of, listen, I believe that my Republican Party agenda would actually benefit not just Republicans, but also Democrats as well, and list examples, I would probably, contest that. I would dispute that. But at least that would be an answer. At least that would be him gesturing in that direction. But they don't even do that.
They don't even do it. And we know that Republicans understand that their agenda is less popular too. Because right now we're seeing one of my favorite things that is kind of in this same theme is the way that Biden has been calling out Republicans who are taking credit for projects that are being brought to their district, that they opposed the legislation that made that happen, that Biden and Democrats successfully implemented. And the way that he does it kind of is that, but I'm a president for all Americans. So he has said multiple times, for example, Tommy Tuberville, you're saying that you're so glad and you're celebrating, look, billions of dollars of broadband investments being made in my state of Alabama, sort of trying to take credit. Well, you oppose this. If you had gotten your way, your citizens would not be benefiting from this policy right now. But I'll see you at the groundbreaking. I'm glad you've come to the right side now. And I want your constituents who you're failing to still have their lives improved because of me.
Yeah, listen, I know we could just keep going on. Let me just say this.
Okay.
I do appreciate how President Biden has been handling this because he could go harder, right? He could go harder. He could wag his finger even more. Instead, like you said, he's like, listen, what's he say? I love a good convert. I love conversion. I'll see you at the groundbreaking. But I at least appreciate that he and the White House in general are taking greater steps to remind constituents gently but clearly that this is President Biden's agenda. Netting them the results and pointing out that in many cases, their representatives, if they had it their way, would not allow their constituents to reap the benefits.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for watching. For the outro on this video, I want to plug Jesiah's channel. Hit them with it, Jesiah.
Hey, everybody. I appreciate you watching. You can find me at youtube.com/@ponderingpolitics. One word, pondering politics. If you like progressive commentary that focuses on coalition building with other elements of the left, and calling the Republican Party out for what it's become, I hope you'll view my channel, give me a like and subscribe and some feedback. Again, youtube.com/@ponderingpolitics. Thanks again.